In a moment I'm going to invite Donna Wallace to come up and say something about Ursula and the memorial lectures, and then my colleague Ruth McElroy will come and introduce Jane, who's known to you. Jane will speak for about an hour, and then there'll be opportunity to ask her some questions about her lecture after that. So thank you very much.
It's my privilege today to say a few words about Dr. Ursula Masson. Ursula Masson was a much-loved colleague here at Glamorgan University for many years. She was a fine scholar, an inspirational teacher, a committed feminist, and an energetic campaigner and organiser. She was a woman who wasn't afraid to speak her mind, and she was also a woman who made things happen. She was born in Merthyr Tydfil, took her first degree at Cardiff University, and then took an MA at the University of Kiel. She worked as a journalist in Australia and then in adult education in Swansea. And then she came here to Glamorgan in the mid-1990s to join the history department here. And as a historian, she became a leading figure in women's history, the field of women's history, particularly Welsh women's political history. And everybody who knows her will know that her passionate commitment to women and to politics underpinned everything she did. It underpinned all her research and her teaching as well. Her published work included 2 editions of women's political writing for Honno Press, Elizabeth Andrews' autobiography memoir, A Woman's Work Is Never Done, and a collection of Welsh women's political writings from Chartism to suffrage, which was called The Very Salt of Life. She also produced an edition of the Minute book of the Aberdare Women's Liberal Association from 1891 to 1907, which was entitled Women's Rights and Womanly Duties. She had a talent for picking a quotation for a title for a book. She was an active member of Llyfr, the Welsh People's History Association, and she was co-editor of their journal, and she was chair of the West of England and South Wales Women History Network. Her own PhD focused on the women's liberal associations in Wales as a way of thinking about the complex interactions between gender, national and party politics, the way they work together. That was published posthumously, again a quotation in the title there, as For Women, for Wales and for Liberalism. That was published by the University of Wales Press. Ursula was also an early proponent of what is now called in RAF speak, impact. In other words, she took academic research, historical research, out of the academy and into the wider world, took it back into the wider world, where in many ways it belongs. She was one of the founders of the Women's Archive of Wales, and their very successful Women's History Roadshows were her idea. She was instrumental in pushing through the Heritage Lottery bid, which produced the funds for that campaign. And she also, of course, set up with Professor Jane Aron the Centre for Gender Studies in Wales here at Glamorgan, which hosts this annual lecture in her memory. Ursula is remembered by her colleagues and her students and her friends, not just for her intellectual rigour and for her inspirational teaching, but also for her warmth and her wit and her courage. And I'd like to hand over now to Ruth McElroy to introduce Professor Jane Aron.
Good evening. Chroeso i'r eitriwm cartre y gyfadron diwydiannau a diwylliannau creadigol Prifysgol Morgannwg yng Nghaerdydd. It's a real privilege to be able to welcome you here to the atrium and to the Creative and Cultural Industries faculty. The Centre for Gender Studies in Wales draws together researchers, both staff and students, that's a very important part of what we do, to provide a focus for cross-faculty, interdisciplinary research in gender and sexuality studies. And whilst our interest is quite broad, we have, of course, a particular interest in Welsh history, in culture and society in particular. And it's in this spirit of cross-faculty collaboration and interdisciplinarity that we decided to host this year's lecture here at the atrium in Cardiff. In order to do this, there are a few people who have had to do quite a lot of work behind the scenes. So I would just like to indulge for a moment to be able to say thank you to the 2 people who are very quietly sat at the back there, Dr. Hugh Jones, who is our wonderful research assistant, who I know many of you will know from emailing him to get your place, and to Anwen, our brilliant camera woman at the back here, who is recording the event so that this is something that we can share with colleagues who are not able to make it here today. So thank you very much to both of you. Our speaker this evening is our very recently retired, or partly retired, or hardly retired at all, really, colleague, Professor Jane Arron, who, together with Ursula, of course, established the centre at Glamorgan. Now, Jane and her work, I know, are known by the vast majority of you here, and that's because she is a scholar who has made such a very substantial contribution to the fields both of women's writing and Welsh literature in English and in Welsh languages. And in doing so, she's played a very active, indeed a formative role in developing research on Welsh women's lives and their literary works since the 18th century. This range of scholarly interest is reflected, of course, in the grand sweep of Jane's publications, which she seemed to want me to not talk about. I think that's undue modesty. So these include 19th century women's writing in Wales, Nation, Gender and Identity, Pur fel y Dyr, y Gymraes yn llen menywod y bedwaredd ganrif ar 15, Pure as Steel, the Welsh women in 19th century women's writing. And of course, she's co-edited several volumes, including Our Sister's Land, The Changing Identities of Women in Wales, Post-Colonial Wales, and most recently, Gendering Border Studies. She's also, and some of you might have seen in the tables downstairs from Honor Press, been very active in her support for that press and in bringing back into print many Welsh women writers. And those editions include A View Across the Valley, short stories from women in Wales 1850 to 1950, Hilda Vaughan's Iron and Gold, and Menna Galli's The Small Mine, amongst others. Jane is also co-editor of the University of Wales's Press Gender Studies in Wales series, and she's a member of the English Unit Assessment Panel for the Research Excellence Framework, which the academic staff in the room will know means that she's going to have a very busy reading year in 2014, like her. So Jane's lecture, as we've said, will be about an hour in length, and there will be some time for questions and comments at the end, so do keep those in mind. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Jane, who's going to speak on the witch as heroine in Welsh Gothic.
And very many thanks to the Centre for Gender Studies in Wales for inviting me to talk to you tonight. It's an honour and a pleasure to be here, giving the fourth Ursula Masson Memorial Lecture. It's lovely to meet so many old friends, particularly Ursula's family. When I told Ursula, some 5 years ago by now, that I'd started doing some research on Gothic writing, I was apologetic about it. I thought she wouldn't think much of my deserting women's studies for zombies and sin-eaters. But she was enthusiastic about the idea. She said it must be refreshingly like wandering through a vast fairground, not knowing what kind of bizarre booth you might come across next. And she was particularly interested in these tales of Welsh witches. So this lecture is for her. The latest research suggests that during the 16th and 17th centuries, about 50,000 Europeans were condemned in the law courts and executed as witches, and that about 80% of that number were women. The bulk of the cases occurred in Germany, but about 2,000 were executed in Britain, hanged in England and burnt at the stake in the lowlands of Scotland. But none were condemned in the Scottish Highlands, and only 4 in the whole of Ireland, and only 3 in Wales. These figures suggest that in those parts of Britain in which Celtic languages were still at this time spoken, attitudes towards those suspected of witchcraft differed from those in other parts of the Isles. The Celtic communities showed greater reluctance than elsewhere to hand them over to the authorities. Why was this so? It cannot have been a legal matter, for though the laws against witchcraft were harsher in Scotland than they were in England until 1604, when James I took the English throne and they became equally severe in England, James I thought he had been the victim of witchcraft. So particularly severe anti-witchcraft laws. But those laws were the same, of course, always for the Scottish Highlands as for the Scottish Lowlands, and of course England and Wales were governed by the same laws. Religious differences may have accounted in part for some of the disparity. Scottish Presbyterianism, then already a force to be reckoned with in the lowlands of Scotland, was particularly harsh in its condemnation of witchcraft. And Puritanism was then more prevalent in England than it was in Wales, the Methodist revivals having not yet succeeded in changing Welsh culture. And yet, the religious differences are not so significant as to explain why, when thousands of witches were executed throughout Protestant and Catholic Europe, only 3 died in Wales. It was no means because of a lack of potential candidates for the appellation witch that the Welsh numbers were so low. On the contrary, from folkloric evidence at least, it would appear that throughout this period and well on into the 18th and 19th centuries, every other Welsh village had its local witch. About 70 people, only 8 of them men, are named as known witches in Eilís Griffith's recent study of witchcraft in Wales. But though their fame was such that their names have come down to us, very few of these were taken to court. In 1588, Cardiff bailiffs were formally reprimanded for not being assiduous enough in bringing witches before the bar, but still no cases were reported. And on the few later Welsh occasions when they were, the local communities of the so-called witches often spoke up in their defence. In 1656, 31 of her neighbours testified in defence of the virtuous character of Dorothy Griffith from Llanasa in Flintshire when she was tried as a witch. And as a result, her judge, who earlier that year had condemned to death the 3 so-called witches from Chester, just over the border, had to release her as innocent. In 1657, some of her neighbours helped Anne Ellis, also from Flintshire, to escape from the prison in which she was held, awaiting trial as a witch. The case of the 3 Welsh people who were hanged as witches is unusual, in that members of the higher social ranks participated in their persecution. In 1622, on the Llŷn Peninsula, Sir John Bodvile wrote to his father-in-law, Sir John of Gwydir, complaining that his tenants were much disturbed by a dispute in which one family accused another of witchcraft. And as a result of his complaint, 3 of his tenants, a brother and 2 sisters, Rhydderch ab Ifan and his sisters Lowri and Agnes, were brought to court and executed as witches. But as the feud had been raging for some years before Sir John's letter, it is a question whether the case would ever have got to court without the noblemen's intervention. Left to their own devices, the Welsh peasantry did not usually take their witches to court, nor did the Irish or the Gaelic-speaking Scots. Why this was so is a question I'm asking myself tonight, and I'll be looking for answers in the literary culture of Wales, that area which adhered most strongly to the Celtic linguistic heritage. Before the development of the novel genre, there are scattered references to witches in Welsh writing. Peredur kills the 7 sorceresses of Gloucester in the early medieval prose tales of the Grail. Witches are mentioned in passing in 2 or 3 works by the bards and the princes. Tom Mornant, in one of his 18th century interludes, refers to witches, and they also inhabit a sphere of hell in Ellis Wynne of Laslanist's Visions of the Sleeping Bard, 1703. But from the early days of the novel form in both of Wales's languages, witches feature significantly, though I fear I won't have the time to draw your attention to more than a brief sample of these witch fictions tonight. There are, for example, 2 schools for witches in Welsh writing, long before the establishment of Hogwarts. In 1805, William Frederick Williams published The Witcheries of Craig Isel, a Gothic history set in the Welsh marshes in the year following the death of William the Conqueror. In the novel, a Norman lord sends his motherless twin daughters, Alice and Friswith de Bolio, over the border to England to be cared for by their aunt, while he enlists in support of the disinherited Robert, Duke of Normandy, imprisoned in Cardiff Castle by the usurper Henry. The novel is much concerned with the rights of inheritance. When the twins arrive at their aunt's castle, her first care is to establish which one of them was first born. Twins, remember? Which one was born first? Following the strict Norman laws of primogeniture, which would not at this pre-conquest time, that is pre-Welsh conquest time, that prevailed in Wales, of course, and I haven't got the same laws this time, but for her, who was born first is all important. She proclaims that the firstborn, Frithwyth, will inherit her property, as well as their father's, and proceeds to make a great distinction between the twins, treating Alice very much as a second-class subject, dependent upon the patronage of her sister. This is the first time twins have been treated in this unequal way. Enraged by her aunt and alienated from her twin, Alice vows vengeance, and her oath is overheard by a local witch, who, promising aid, leads her out of her aunt's lands and back across the border into Wales, telling her, south of this place stands a mountain called by the wandering shepherds Craigisab. The place is lonely, and as the benighted traveller approaches, awful yet indistinct forms flit before his eyes, and the secret terrors of his soul inform him that he is treading on forbidden ground. No wolf seeks on that hill a den for her young. No bird rests upon it. It is shunned by man and beast, and the Cambrian peasant often relates to a trembling circle the various instances of power evinced by the dreaded sorceress of Craigisab. Hasten thither, seek the most potent in the magic art, and she will befriend you. She can command the powers of darkness. In effect, what's happening here is that the two motherless Debolio sisters are becoming polarized as the good and the bad twin, as they ally themselves with these opposing alternative mother figures. The rigid aunt, obsessed with hierarchies, and the anarchical sorceress coupled with darkness. But when Alice finally arrives at Craigisab, deep in the wilds of Wales, it is for her from the start a luminous palace of delight. As she enters it, accompanied by a couple of fellow witch apprentices who have come out to meet her, a fanfare greets her approach. The martial music still sounded. The inspiring breath of the trumpet communicated an ardour before unknown to the bosom of Alice, and she proceeded with her companions rather with the march of a conqueror than the humility of a dependent. Her new friends ask her how she feels about arriving at Craigisab. Happy, oh most happy, exclaimed Alice. Till now I never lived. I feel existence for the first time. According to her companions, more intense joy yet is in store for her. They tell her, wait but a while, and you will experience the unspeakable happiness enjoyed by the votaries of liberty who spurn all bonds. This is the language of revolution, still most potent in Britain in 1805, 16 years after the storming of the Bastille, 10 years after the Reign of Terror. After she has successfully undergone the rites of entry into the coven, which include plunging a dagger into the heart of a prostrate form she has been persuaded is her sister, but it is in fact only a fawn. She goes through these rites. Alice is duly